Hi everyone, Tundele here and welcome to the Africa History channel, where we bring to you snippets of African history from the perspective of Africans themselves. In the first episode in this History of the Fulani series, we discussed the first of the Fulani states in West Africa, the non-Islamic empire of the Great Fulu, and then followed with a second episode on the first that was an Islamic state, the Bundu Imamate. You can watch these two in the links in the description below. In today's episode, we will look at the first of the Fulani Islamic states to be established by actually fighting a jihad, the Imamate of Futa Djallon. Let's get started. The area that became known as Futa Djallon is a highland at the watersheds of the Niger, Gambia, and Senegal rivers in modern-day Republic of Guinea. The aboriginal people of this area are tribes such as the Limba, Basari, Landuma, and the Baga. Fulani also came into the region seasonally to graze their cattle, setting up temporary camps. However, under the Ghana Empire, some Soso people began to move into the area. At this time, they were not in such large numbers as to displace the people they met on ground. This changed after the short-lived Soso Empire of Sumaworo Kante was defeated by the rising Mandinka of Mali under Sundiata Keita in 1235, as we mentioned in the first episode of this series. While some Soso remained in the north, a large number moved south into the Futa Djallon area, and many of the aboriginal groups were either displaced or absorbed by these migrant Soso. The mix of the Soso and the aboriginal people of the Futa Djallon highlands came to be known as the Djallonke or Yalonka people. They established small independent states such as the Bena along the Great Cassis River, but never united into a large centralized state in the area as they did under Sumaworo earlier. Their economy was based on farming millet, rice, and funda, which supported the small states and enabled the emergence of a specialist class of miners and iron workers in the area they controlled. Iron was a precious commodity used for utensils and weapons, and the Djallonke traded this with both the hinterland peoples as well as the coastal peoples, growing wealthy. Islam was present, but was not a great force amongst them. Most of the Djallonke followed their traditional religion. In the 1300s, there was an increase in the influx of nomadic Fulani into the area from the Mali Empire to the east. Perhaps they left due to the exactions of being under a centralized state, and they were more at home under a less centralized people like the Djallonke. Due to this, with the permission of various Djallonke chiefs, they began to settle closer to Djallonke towns. Their nomadic culture was in contrast to the more sedentary Djallonke, and a flourishing trade went on between them. The Fulani were mostly animists as well at this time, and it was from amongst them that Tengela migrated north to establish the Empire of the Great Fulu in 1490. There were also Mande Muslims as well as Fulani Muslims, and many of them were traveling clerics who were skilled at medicine and healing. They made amulets that most of the animists believed to be very powerful, which they called grigris. These were very popular and they fit well into the traditional beliefs of both the Djallonke and Fulani animists. In fact, the great Islamic centers at this time were further east, within the Mali Empire, in places like Timbuktu, Djenné, and the Malian capital of Niamey. It was around the time the Fulani were migrating in great numbers into Futa Djallon that Mansa Musa embarked on his now famous pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324. The relationship between these new settlers and the Djallonke was tense from the onset. The Fulani were taxed heavily by the Djallonke. For example, on every cow killed by the Fulani, up to a third went to the Djallonke as tax. The Djallonke also restricted Fulani grazing lands to less fertile lands, which they were not using for their traditional farming. In addition, the Fulani could not trade without having a Djallonke partner. In this way, the balance of wealth was always in favor of the Djallonke. Trade was the big factor in these early days that brought the whole Futa Djallon society together. They organized annual caravans that were between 2,000 to 3,000 strong that would include Djallonke, Fulani, and Mandinka. They would go to the coast with Djallonke produce like their prized iron bars, weapons, clothing, and dyes, as well as Fulani produce like cattle, hides, and gum. The primary item they took in return was the most prized one of those times: salt, produced in large quantities by the coastal peoples in the many creeks and swamps there. This trade was entirely between African peoples, and Europeans were not involved at this time. Crucially, slaves were not a big part of this trade. In addition, because the most prized items in the trade were of Djallonke production, it concentrated the trade wealth in their hands, reinforcing their dominance over the Fulani. Another important aspect that was minor at this point but would become significant in future was that because of their itinerant nature, both Fulani and non-Fulani Muslims were very prominent as traders. This was the system of Djallonke dominance that Tengela fled in 1490, and it will continue until the late 1600s, when a combination of three factors changed the balance of power in Futa Djallon in favor of the Muslim elements within the Fulani, precipitating in the Jihad of 1727, which created the Imamate of Futa Djallon. The first of these changes came with the arrival of Europeans on the coast, especially from the mid-1500s, when their primary demands moved from gold to slaves. We will remember that the primary items the Europeans brought to trade were guns, cloth, metal bars, utensils, and alcohol. Two of these were the primary items the Djallonke traded, and over time, the European imports outcompeted them. In addition, the Europeans needed large supplies of cattle to feed themselves, and they wanted large quantities of animal hides, wax for candle making, gum, and camwood. These were products that the Fulani primarily produced. For example, Portuguese trader Fernando Guerreiro claimed that by 1606, the Europeans were purchasing 40,000 hides from Futa Djallon annually. In the same period, a single candlestick could cost as high as a full day's wage in Europe, making wax a prized commodity. This led to a slow but steady shift in wealth towards the Fulani. In addition, since much of the trade had been controlled by the Muslim elements among the Fulani and the Mande in Futa Djallon, a large portion of this wealth went to them. Because of their extensive trade linkages even beyond the borders of Futa Djallon, they also became the most successful slave traders in the area. This was, of course, not a quick process, but it stretched over at least a century into the mid-1600s. The second factor was also somewhat of a response to this. As the demand for Fulani products went up from the coast, there was a large influx of Fulani into the Futa Djallon area from far and wide to meet this need. Two nearly distinct groups came into the area from different areas. Some came in from the southeast in the aftermath of the collapse of Imperial Mali in the late 1500s and settled gradually in the southern parts of Futa Djallon. Another wave came in from the north, from Futa Toro, Mauritania, and later on the Bundu Imamate, in response to the opportunities in Futa Djallon and in the aftermath of the failed jihads in these places. The population explosion of Fulani in the area and the increased demands of the herds that expanded to meet the booming trade at the coast with the Europeans saw the Fulani requiring more land in quantity as well as quality to pasture for their herds, causing them to go beyond the lands allocated by the Djallonke overlords. The Djallonke also attempted to extract more tax from the increasing Fulani wealth. This widened the fault lines. As always, the accumulation of wealth in a subordinate class always leads them to question the status quo. The Djallonke were unable to adjust their system to accommodate this new class of wealthy Fulani, and they became more determined to throw off the Djallonke yoke. Many of the captives that were sold as slaves came from the civil wars and conflicts from the collapse of the Mali Empire. Mandinka Muslim merchants who brought these captives to Futa Djallon also found it more expedient to deal with the Muslim Fulani elements. They would prove crucial to the jihad in Futa Djallon. The third and final factor was the growth in Islam amongst the Fulani brought by the influx from the north of the learned Torodbe clerics who were fleeing the failed jihad in the Empire of the Great Fulu from 1677 and who passed the nominally Fulani Islamic Bundu state to reach Futa Djallon. These clerics would bring a more fiery version of Islam that would mix with the first two elements that were already on the ground to lead to the outbreak of the jihad in Futa Djallon in 1725. Join us in the next episode as we follow how the Futa Djallon state arose and how it ultimately fell. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. See you next time.